So I'll go very briefly because I've made you lose a bit of time already, but sorry for that. And thank you very much indeed for the previous speaker in particular and for the points that he made. Just a quick remark is that it's a surprise for me to read what are the objectives of the Hungarian legislation in the light of the Hungarian government's position in the current discussions on the Renewable Energy Directive, because they're not aligned. I mean, this is context about the use of biomass in Europe, and I think you've gone through that already, so we'll just skip all these issues. And I will directly go to the existing RED II sustainability criteria. They've been mentioned already here, but just to mention the really big issue with these criteria is that they're not based on outcome, but they're based on an assumption of legality. That is, it's a legal check. Essentially, the current sustainability criteria define a certain number of general aims that member states' legislation has to have, and that's it. And that doesn't mean at all, of course, that these would be, this would deliver practices that are, climate friendly or even sustainable. Also, it puts member states themselves in a situation of conflict of interest because they are setting their own rules, so to speak. So that's the situation in which we are. And keep in mind that, of course, this legislation has created very, very significant incentives for the use of biomass, either direct through the, direct financial support through subsidies or reduced VAT, it depends, or indirect support through the zero rating of biomass emissions. And this is very, very significant. We're talking about, at current carbon prices, we're talking about a general incentive that is above 20 billion euros per year to this sector. And the conflation of this and the recent event, with the Russian aggression of Ukraine, creates a perfect storm, so to speak, because we are losing almost 10% of the wood imports to the EU. We are facing a very strong increase in the energy prices, which makes wood much more attractive as an energy source, despite that this would come, at the expense of forests and people's health. So to keep these incentives around in this point in time is just asking for abuse. And right now, the situation is very contrasted. So our position, to start with the beginning, has been for the past year, and actually longer than that, that primary woody biomass, that is essentially roundwood or unprocessed wood, should be completely removed from these incentives. That also means that, so no subsidies, no zero rating of emissions for that type of wood. And that represents about a little less than half of the wood used for bioenergy in the EU today. You will also see that our position also consists in demanding that the cascading principle is used, that is, the material uses of wood are prioritized as opposed to energy uses. And I will briefly touch on the revision of the Lulucf regulation, even though that is not my area of specialty. But we have been demanding, we in this sense is the broader Brussels and EU civil society in that case, a rather considerable actually increase of the ambition, and that's to increase the sink, because I think this has been mentioned previously, but the land sink in the EU has been decreasing for the past decade already, and we are in a very, very low state. And to echo a bit what has been said about a previous speaker, we would very much favor, and that's our demand actually, that the current financial support for bioenergy is redirected to better and closer to nature forest management, because we need wood, but we can't keep producing wood at the expense of our future. And that seems to be the case, unfortunately, in too many places. To go to the next slide. So last July, we had a legislative proposal by the European Commission. That was a very mixed bag. On the positive side, you can say that it's quite clear, I mean, in our opinion, at least, in our analysis, that the European Commission has understood that they had literally a burning problem with biomass. And so they are proposing a certain number of measures to limit these incentives. But the problem is that these measures do not raise to the challenge, so to speak. There is good, general language about the need to keep biomass sustainable, but when you go to the actual measures, and that's what counts at the end, you can see that for example, they're proposing to exclude certain feedstocks, and that's a novelty, and that's very good. From the support, that's what we want. But the feedstocks are things that, in general, are not burnt today, like saw logs, that's timber, that has a much higher commercial value still today as timber as firewood. Vanilla logs, even more so. Roots and stumps, that is good, because removing roots and stumps is probably the worst thing you can do in a forest in terms of soil carbon, and also for the regeneration of the forest. So that's a good sign, but we are very far from what we need, which is in our opinion, at the minimum, primary woody biomass, like that is roundwood, unprocessed wood. One rather significant proposal that they made is to exclude primary and old growth forests from the territories where you can source biomass from. That is actually a legacy of the palm oil disaster, if you recall, where the sourcing of agricultural biomass from primary forests has been banned. And that the idea is that you avoid cutting primary forests to produce agricultural biomass instead. This has now been broadened by the Commission as a proposal to forest biomass, and that's good. In Europe, it's not a lot. I mean, primary and old growth forests only represents maximum 3% of European forests, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't protect them. It's very important. But it's probably more significant when it comes to imports, because in there's increasing amounts of wood being imported from North America. And very often, unfortunately, these are the outcome of logging operations in old or even primary forests, in the case of British Columbia. So that could have a significant impact there. The Commission also proposed to exclude support to electricity production, which is very good, because electricity production out of biomass is an extremely inefficient process, and it's really a waste to be doing it, and even more to be incentivizing it. The problem is that, so they gave us this, but they are kind of withdrawing what they're giving us with one hand, they are taking back from the other hand, because there are two loopholes introduced. One is that biomass plants in in regions in a just transition, that is typically the regions where you have a lot of coal-fired power plants that could shift to biomass. And this probably is the biggest risk we're facing, is that all these coal-fired power plants are now converted to wood. So this kind of removes, the exclusion from the areas where it is most needed. The other loophole is about BECCS, Bioenergy with a carbon capture and storage, which we don't believe is something that should receive incentives as well. The Commission did propose, and that's a novelty, to introduce the cascading principle, that is to prioritize material uses, but there again, the language used is quite vague, only focuses on quality roundwood, which again is normally not used for bioenergy, but more for timber, furniture, those sort of things. And so that's not really, to repeat what I said at the beginning. The acknowledgement of the problem is good, but the concrete measures considered are not up to the stakes, and even more so given the situation that we are facing now, 1 year later. The European Parliament's Environment Committee, on the other hand, and this is from last May, did get the issue, and which is very rare for an environmental NGO to say, but actually followed us all the way. They are excluding primary woody biomass from even renewables targets, which is amazing, I would say, which is really what we need. And so really applause and kudos to them. But as you will see, I mean, that's very significant. That's removing the direct, indirect support. It's also removing the bioenergy industry from accessing the green finance under the EU taxonomy for the energy produced out of primary woody biomass, not the whole of biomass. And what is a residue? It's always the big question. And there has been recent investigations showing that, for example, wood pellets are typically, used to be typically produced with sawmill residues, with sawdust. But now, because of the increase in the demand, we see that whole logs are being used for that. And that means that the REDD incentives have created a market to log trees that would not have been logged before because they were not, the right species, the right shape, the right age, because they were damaged. And those have very high biological value. They are a forest, basically. And unfortunately, now there is an economic incentive to log these trees and to make wood pellets out of them. So again, what is a residue? But again, still, thank you to the Environment Committee of the European Parliament for adopting this opinion. And these proposals are going now to the plenary vote mid-September. And it is still possible to win this from the Parliament. And that's very, very important. I should also add that they introduced something that they thought of, which is to introduce national bioenergy plans, which, depending on how they're implemented, could function as a sort of a cap, as a ceiling for the total amount of biomass that a given country can support. And that's potentially also very good because we don't have that today. We are facing a situation where the use of wood for energy could explode. And as we speak, there is no ceiling, there is no capping of the incentives. So let's see. Of course, the way you define primary biomass is, in this context, is extremely important. And I will spare you the details, but excuse me?
No, but please go on.
Okay. No, because if I'm too long, just tell me. So the first part in the higher frame is what you see. The complete definition is the 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph is the established definition for roundwood, but the second paragraph is the outcome of political negotiations. And some of these loopholes, you could say, are potentially damaging because we know that some of these arguments have been used to excuse, logging in even primary forests, for example, in Poland or British Columbia. Now, last week was the opinion of the Council of the EU, that's national governments. A rather different opinion there. They're doing worse than the Commission, and this was supported by Hungary and the Scandinavian and Baltic countries, but also Poland, the Czech Republic, a qualified majority, to cut a long story short. The only member states opposing this, unfortunately, were not sufficient. Germany was one of them. It's not every day that Germany loses, but that happens in the Council. You could also mention Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, for those who spoke prominently against that. But so, no, the Council no longer excludes primary and old growth forests from the sustainability criteria. It's a bit of a longer story, but they are making this part of the legality check. And no longer the way the Commission had proposed it, which is something binding. They are also weakening the introduction of the cascading principle, And they are doubling the power thresholds. That's something that I didn't mention, but basically there is a threshold under which biomass installations do not have to respect the sustainability criteria, whatever they are. And the member states have made this twice higher. And now that's the really scary part. Because of the Russian war in Ukraine, there are some emergency measures being taken at the EU level to fast track and accelerate the deployment of renewables, and that's very good. Interestingly, the first draft, and so that's the Repower EU communication that the Commission came with last May, mid-May. Interestingly, when they published their first draft mid-March, the word bioenergy was not even mentioned in that, which reflects, I think, and I hope, the understanding by the Commission that bioenergy is a problem more than a solution now. The problem is that this was a red line for Scandinavian states in particular, who lobbied very hard and obtained that bioenergy is reintroduced. But you might have heard and discussed that already, but the European Commission considered designing go-to areas, and those are special areas where you can develop and build renewable projects like wind or solar without having to do an environmental impact assessment and with a much faster permitting. But they excluded biomass installations from this exclusion. Again, that reflects that the Commission hopefully, clearly actually, understands that biomass is not renewable like the other. Unfortunately, that crucial distinction was not kept by the Council last week. And so in the Council opinion, it's still an opinion, but it's the member states, so that, that counts for a lot. They are no longer excluding biomass installations from, this kind of fast track procedures. So if this goes through, that means that biomass installations in certain go-to areas designated by member states would no longer have to undergo an environmental impact assessment. So we would be facing with not only a continuation, but an acceleration of the problem that we are having with biomass. So let me now go to the next steps, because this is not over. Next week, we have a vote by the Industry and Research Committee in the European Parliament on the revision. The last language I've seen is not too bad, actually. They are still, defining the cascading principle. They haven't touched the sustainability criteria, but that belongs to the Environment Committee. They haven't touched the definition of primary woody biomass, even though they could have. That was a shared competence. So this will happen. And then we are moving to one of the most important moments in this whole revision, which is the plenary vote mid-September by the European Parliament. And that is the text that we will have to oppose a counterweight to what the Council has decided next week. Once the Parliament has voted, we will go to what is called the trilogues negotiations. So those are direct negotiations between the three institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, representing member states, to agree on a common text that they will then have to vote in identical terms in the Council and in the Parliament. So with this revision, we are still probably until this is going to happen under the Czech presidency, and unfortunately, the position of the Czech Republic so far on this file has not been good. But if this goes too long, this will now go to the first semester of 2023, and that will happen under the presidency of Sweden. And Sweden is probably one of the worst countries when it comes to this file, unfortunately. So let's see. Let's see what happens. Finally, once this, and that's very important for you to remember as well, this is a directive. It means it becomes binding legislation only from the moment member states have transposed it in national legislation. And there is no requirement for member states to keep the incentives for biomass. what this directive does is it enables them to support biomass without infringing on internal market legislation. But it doesn't force them to do so. So member states could decide to not incentivize biomass, even after this revision. None of them is doing that today, but it is a possibility. And yeah, a word on the revision of the Lulucf. So that's the land use overall target to define the climate sink. The process has gone faster there because it's a regulation. So in this case, both the European Parliament and the Council have approved their respective opinions. The European Parliament is better. It is still, the level of ambition that they have agreed to is, okay, let's be positive. It's better than what we have today. It's slightly more ambitious. It is considerably less ambitious than what could be done technically. It's like twice less ambitious. But still, it's an improvement. The Council, on the other hand, managed to make this a very, very, very complicated text, essentially keeping the general level of ambition adopted by the Parliament, but adding many, many so-called flexibilities, that is, loopholes. I have included in the presentation direct links to our analysis of that, so you can go and go and check more the details if you like. And with this, I am finished. I apologize if I've been too long.